And like Proverbs says, a person's intentions are deep waters, and we're trying to draw them out, but you got to hear them. And when they do, the crack starts to open a little bit. Now we're talking, but not until we understand. So many conflicts go away when somebody feels hurt.
Dr. Henry Cloud, welcome to the podcast. What a thrill to finally meet you.
Oh, it's good to be here, Chris.
I'm excited about today's conversation, and the focus of our conversation today is trust. It's a linchpin to relationships, as we all know, and I want to start right here. Everything rises and falls on trust in our lives. Tell us why.
Well, I like to say, in fact, I think I started the book with a statement kind of like, trust is the fuel of life. It literally, and I can't overemphasize this, trust makes everything work. For example, we've been sitting here, I don't know if you noticed or not in the last minute, Chris, but you've been breathing, I think, right? You look like you have. Now, your whole system is wired 24/7, every millisecond of every day and night. Your system is wired down your spinal column, through your brain, through all of your cells, through your psyche, through your heart, through your gut, to ask one question all the time. And that question is, am I safe? Now, physically, your algorithm has come up with hit the green button in the last minute on breathing. It took all the data and it said it's safe. You can be careless. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to watch your back. And so you've been able to take in life from the outside. You've been able to take in air. But if you smelled a fume, a toxic fume or something, long before it even came to your consciousness, your system would have hit pause. Now you can't take in life from the outside. See, God's the only self-sustaining being. The rest of us draw life from outside of ourselves. And so, for example, if you're running a business, you will never be able to do anything if you can't trust a team member to go open up that new division or to manage that store. Or if a customer can't trust you, they're not going to invest, they're not going to move towards. Trust is everything in a relationship. It allows us to connect. It allows us to give and receive. It is literally everything. And when it breaks down, it's a big problem. And if you notice the subtitle of the book, there's basically 4 areas of this we need to be, having it work correctly. We need to know when to give it, when to breathe, when to trust someone, and with what to trust them. Secondly, we got to know when to withhold it. Some of our biggest train wrecks in life are trusting somebody when we shouldn't have. The third one is we got to know how to earn it and build it from our side. And then fourthly, we have to know how to break or fix it when it gets broken. So you just can't overemphasize it enough. It is pretty much everything. I've never been called into a situation in a business or a family or a relationship, no matter what the situation is. It could be pain, it could be performance, it could be getting to the next level, where some issue of trust is not involved.
I want to stay on what you mentioned about safety and trust. I think about this quote actually from Dr. Townsend's and your quote from your book, Safe People. You both wrote, the first step to safety is to understand that you have a right to be safe. Talk more about that in relation to safety and trust.
Well, you always hate to use the word right because it implies so much. But people need to know that I'm a steward of my own life, right? And so as a steward, I have the right to decide who I'm going to trust and who I'm not going to trust. And it might even be the right person. I have the right to go at my own pace, to get there, because I need to have agency. I need to have self-control. And a lot of times what happens is we kind of surrender our rights. We give in to control. We give in to seduction. We give in to, somebody's manipulation. We give in to ignorance, and we move forward. And sometimes you might get lucky and it turned out okay, but oftentimes, if we hadn't checked all the right boxes, we can make a big mistake. I mean, how many people have pretty soon fallen in love, real quickly, and the person may be awesome in a couple of the boxes, but they hadn't checked all the boxes. And then the further you get down the road, those deficits start to appear, and then you feel it. I mean, you end up, suffering for it. So pretty important thing.
So what about when someone says, just trust me? I think you sort of said that should be a red flag. I mean, neuroscience even tells us we shouldn't do that. I want to hear more about that.
Well, I mean, how many times usually somebody says that when we're having some sort of question, right? Well, if somebody is not open to being questioned, then that's not okay. I mean, if somebody is trustworthy, opens up the books to you, right? And you don't have to just take some leap. You know what you're trusting. And so when people are trying to persuade us before they have really kind of earned the right for us to be persuaded, then, you might get lucky, but, probably not.
Sure. Right.
Oftentimes not, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not all bad. It's like, look, just trust me. I mean, I know what I'm doing. Yeah, but I got to get you to feeling comfortable where you know that I know what I'm doing. And that's the it's a loop. Somebody can really understand everything that we need, but if we don't understand that they understand, then there's hesitation. And then you have one foot in and one foot out. And that ends up in all sorts of dynamics.
What about when fear is the dominant driver in our lives? Fear is the dominant motivator in our lives, like fear of vulnerability, fear of taking a risk. How does that affect mutual trust then? What does that do to our posture in being able to give and receive trust?
Interestingly, it can make us trust more or less.
Tell me why.
Because here's one of the biggest mistakes. Everybody always thinks about fear as, it is a barrier to trust, because we have a psychologists call it a need-fear dilemma. The greater our need, the more afraid we are, because the more powerless and helpless and needy of that person we feel. And so the greater our need, the more the fear is. And the greater the fear, the more we move away. And the more we move away, the greater our need grows. And so people, you kind of stay hungry because you're afraid of the food, but you stay away from the food, and then you get hungrier, and then you're more afraid. But on the other side, sometimes it's in our greatest need that we and out of the fear of not having, then we make stupid steps of trust. Somebody's afraid of abandonment, for example. So they put up with bad behavior that they shouldn't trust because of a bigger fear. So fear actually, it always does the same thing. It makes us fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so the flight is the well-known moving away because I'm afraid, but the fight sometimes can be, I'm fighting the abandonment. And so my fear drives me to connect with somebody and hold on to maybe somebody hurtful. And then sometimes we just get paralyzed, and, it's instead of radiating fire, you get ready.
Yes.
And a lot of times, we talk about mistrusting, but one of the biggest problems I go into in the book is that sometimes our trust muscle is broken. And because we've been hurt, we do have a lot of fear, like you're saying, and perfectly good nutrients can be right in front of us. But we're afraid to jump in. We're afraid to trust. We're risk averse in that area. So the trust muscle can have a lot of different injuries that go a lot of different ways. And what I tried to do in the book was kind of simplify it to a dashboard to let you know, look, here's a handful of things that you got to work on. Can you check the boxes? And it's not like it takes forever, but you ought to be able to check the boxes.
I want to put a pin in the trust muscle. I think it's such an important thing to discuss, but I want to drill down, if you would, on this need-fear dilemma that you mentioned, because I think, Dr. Cloud, even as you were talking, I think about areas of dysfunction in my own life and things I've had to hurdle, because how many people joined with us today are behaving, are thinking in a certain way, in a certain pattern of thinking and behaving that is dysfunctional and destructive, and they just think it's Tuesday. They don't know they're being motivated by fear of lack, as you said, fear of abandonment. Will you unpack that need-fear dilemma just a little more so that we can see clearly? Because I want people to hurdle this and get healthier.
Let's take a very common example that you see. If you know, a lot of times you hear this, if you hang around a lot of singles, if you're married and have a lot of single friends, somebody's going to be on one end of the quote commitment phobia, right? So, you know, a single woman friend of yours comes and pours her heart out. You know, I thought we had something, and then we got really, really close, and it looked like and then he bailed, right? And after a pattern of that with certain people, we call it a commitment phobia. Well, he probably thinks he's doing fine, right? And he's out there dating, and he chose a perfectly good woman and started dating her. And like you're saying, he doesn't know that this is an issue. But because it's an issue that he's never worked through, then he'll build up defense mechanisms against that underlying fear of either being overwhelmed or controlled, or his need for love is too great, which makes him subject to fear of rejection or abandonment, whatever. And so he starts to get close, and he starts to say, well, you know, she's just not this enough, or she's not that enough, or she kind of bugs me. And you start to find things wrong in order to justify them moving away. And so a lot of times, you know, I'll give you another example. You know, in the business world, I work mainly with CEOs, and a lot of times I'll tell people, you know, when they ask what you do, I'll say that. And some people I'll instantly get, oh, yeah, that must be fun. I mean, they're all narcissistic now for themselves. And I'll go, well, actually, that's not the case. Some are, you know, just like in the church, there are some good pastors, there are some lousy ones, right? They're, you know, wolves in sheep clothing. And look, you're going to find good and bad everywhere, but sometimes people that might have been so burned by authority that, and they think they're smart. You know, I'm not gonna join a big corporation because they're all evil or something like that. And so they think they're fine. In fact, in some ways, they think they're above it all. But some opportunity comes along that might be the best thing that could ever happen to them, and find a way to spoil it. So it's just, you know, a big thing that operates within this, there's a cognitive process. You've heard of it. It's called confirmation bias.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's when we have a certain way of viewing things, and then we'll find some little piece of data to justify it and say, see, I told you. And then we move away. And so many times that's fear and woundedness that's behind that. And that's why it goes back to, Chris, you know, the stronger your immune system is, the more places you can go, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The weaker our immune system is, sometimes we even have to be quarantined because any little bacteria can do us in. So it's not all about avoiding, you know, people with issues or, you know, tough situations. It's primarily about our becoming strong enough where we can negotiate any situation. And some of them figure out they truly are evil and we need to run away, but some of them, they're difficult. We need to embrace and resolve problems. And that's why our own, you know, the popular term nowadays is resiliency. You know, the Bible calls it a bunch of other stuff, mainly maturity or completeness. And when we're becoming whole, then we are more apt to be able to deal with the whole landscape as it presents itself.
This is really interesting, Dr. Claude, because I'm thinking now about growing a muscle in our physical body. It requires a level of resistance. When we're talking about building our trust muscle, what type of resistance is healthy and good in that in that way of thinking, that will cause us to grow the trust muscle.
It's a great analogy, Chris. When you go to the gym, if all you're doing is lifting the weight that you've lifted for 15 years, you're not getting any stronger. You're pretty safe, right? And you're probably pretty toned at that level, but you're not growing. And so for us to grow in any dimension of character, then we're going to have to place ourselves in situations that do provide some sort of resistance or strain. And so, for example, let's just take business, or marriage is a good one too. If somebody, they only hang around, they come from a wonderful, loving family and everybody thinks they're, special, and they get the little red "you're special" plate at every meal, and they get a trophy every time they show up, and nobody's ever questioned them, this, that, and the other. Well, they're not going to be very resilient in order to handle extremely difficult scenarios. You get into a marriage, and for example, you're going to have somebody that's going to, bum you out sometimes, or somebody's going to do something you got to confront, or they're going to confront you. And that's why we take kids early on and get them out of the house. They got to go on the playground, and they got to, learn. Johnny gives me one of his cookies and Billy wants to throw sand in my eyes. Well, good for you to learn that, because now you're learning the difference between the Johnnies and the Billies of the world. And the trust muscle has got to be formed and shaped. And the higher you go, especially in, I see this all the time in the business world, you got to be discerning. Jesus is really interesting. The parable of the shrewd servant, where the guy was not performing and he gets fired, but he goes out and reduces the debt of some of the people that owe his boss. And Jesus praises him for his shrewdness, which actually we tend to see shrewd as a negative word. And the scriptures actually describe God as shrewd. What it means is having extremely good judgment. That's what the word, it's a neutral term. And that judgment's got to be built. You got to know, how many times, thinking you're growing up. And I remember when I was a little boy, and we went down to the park, and there's a big football stadium there. And my best friend sold it to me for $0.25. And I came home so happy about this great deal that I got. I was probably, 6 years old.
Yeah.
My parents started laughing. Because, I don't know if he was lying to me, and he thought he could do that, or maybe he was lying to me. But I learned that not everything that glitters is gold, and not everything everybody tells you, even if they think it's believable, is believable. And so I was reading in Proverbs this morning where, the naive or the simple, when, evil presents itself, they keep going into their own destruction, but the wise person is able to discern it. So there's a lot of discernment in trust, but it's not rocket science. Every human being is designed neurologically, psychologically, spiritually to be able to determine trustworthiness when it shows up. The problem is, like I said, we're immature and our trust muscle gets broken and a bunch of other stuff.
This is really interesting to me because moments ago you were talking about how shrewdness is a character quality we need, and it is built. So this phrase jumped in my head, and it is this: avoidance is atrophy. And if we go back to this metaphor of the trust muscle, avoidance is atrophy. What's the lane then, Dr. Cloud, that we should stay in so that we are exposing ourselves to healthy levels of discernment so that this trust muscle can be built? I think about avoidance.
Say that sentence again. What is the what that we should stay in?
The lane that we should stay in. In other words, I think about avoidance in this way. If someone says, Dr. Cloud, I'm not afraid of flying, but they never get on an airplane,
Right.
It's sort of that thing. So if avoiding pain...
The worst thing you can have is a life with no stress.
Tell me more.
I mean, we know that from all the research in the world.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's a book written about this. My brother-in-law was describing it to me recently called The Comfort Crisis.
Michael Easter. Yeah.
And it's how our whole lives are designed more and more and more comfort, less and less, strain. And that's not the way you build a human.
No.
Now, what we want to do is we want to avoid injurious stress. We want to seek stretching stress. The mind can only learn new behaviors in a moment of arousal, okay? Because it's the arousal that releases the chemicals to the hippocampus that binds that experience and that new behavior in a way that produces new wiring to be able to do it again. And so if we're not a little bit out over our skis all the time, we're going backwards, period. I mean, period. This is why they want you to get your heart rate up, however many minutes a week, because that's making it strong. Now, they don't want to blow it out where you keel over from a MI or something, but if you're not moving, if you're on the couch, and we got a lot of, unfortunately, we got a lot of kids that are being raised on the couch with a video control in their hand when they ought to be out there fighting real battles on the schoolyard,
I don't want to take too much time on this, but that statement really provokes me in a really inspiring way. They should be out on the playground fighting real battles. Dr. Cloud, if we're talking about instilling trust in our kids, raising up this next generation to be men and women of integrity and character, what have we missed in the last few years? Where have we missed the mark? I think about your book. Goodness, it was probably 15 years ago I read your book about integrity, the courage to meet the demands of reality. I'll never forget that. What are we missing?
Yeah. Oh, don't get me started on this one. My hair might catch on fire.
I'm here for
it. I just cannot believe the popular phrase for it, and it's a pretty good one, is what's been referred to as the helicopter parenting, where what you're doing, and you know what, Chris, this actually starts, I see some parenting stuff in there. This starts in toddlerhood. You see parenting instructions, for example, when toddlers are beginning to exert the what I call the terrific twos, not the terrible twos. They're exerting themselves and learning. There used to be this whole thing, you got to break the will of the child. Remember all that? Who came up with that?
Right.
They're going to need that will in the backseat of a car when they're 15 to say no to drugs or, sex. I mean, to break their will, you break their will, you've created a cripple. What we have to do is discipline that will, which means instruct, inform, and strengthen so they will for good and they will against bad. And one of the things you have now is, back to the toddler thing, I remember when our kids were little, there was this big thing. They're 21 and 22 now, but so it hasn't been that long ago. We'd be with parents and, some little, 2-year-old wants this toy or this, that, and the other, and they shouldn't have it for whatever reason. And so, and parents were being taught, well, don't say no, give them another choice. Divert them. Give them another choice. I thought I was going to explode.
Oh my God.
I go, their boss is not going to give them another choice. The speed limit is not going to give them another choice. They need to hit a wall and learn that is a stress moment of learning how to accept a limit and then negotiate through that. And that builds character, emotional regulation, impulse control, a host of other things, because they hit a limit and they had to learn to adapt to a limit. Well, it won't be long before you're building, I'm entitled to something good thing I want all the time. I should never hear no. And then you get into the helicopter parenting thing where, you rescue them from every dilemma. One of my favorite passages about this, I think it's Romans 5:1, where it talks about trials and how trials build perseverance, which builds character, which builds hope.
That's it.
Okay. The Greek word there for trial, actually, the root of it means to be placed in a situation that you cannot escape. Now, you got a helicopter parent that comes and bails them out of every situation. They're not going to build the persevering in that and having to change within to build the character. This is what timeout does. When a kid is, I remember my daughters would throw a fit or whatever, say, okay, you have to go in timeout. And they're screaming. It's like, you know what? You're not getting out of there when you're screaming. When I hear silence here's the clock. And if you scream, it starts over. They had to learn to be in a situation they could not escape and learn to self-regulate, say, okay, I'll stop screaming. That's so good. Mm-hmm. And there's all sorts of adult, versions of that, to have to face into a conflict. You can't escape it until you go resolve that conflict, for example. I mean, this is endless. It's just endless about how we're not building character a lot of times. I'll shut up about this one because this is.
I love this. I love it.
But I'll give you one more example.
Great.
Our oldest daughter's 22. She graduated last spring. She was a young graduate. So in the fall, she moved. She was going to move to New York to start her career. And so she says, I'll be moving in September. I'm coming home for the summer. I said, great. Love to have you here for the summer before you launch. And she said, yeah, I'll be going in the fall. Well, September comes around. Her roommate wasn't getting the job she needed that she was going to move with. And so she says, it's probably going to be the end of the year. I said, all right, you can live here till the end of the year and I'll feed you, but not outside. You go out, that's on your dime. But December 31st, you'll be getting something you've never had before. It's called an eviction notice. And that means it's over and you're going to have to go find your own place. Now, I'll be glad to rent you your room, but this place is really expensive. You can probably find something cheaper somewhere else. And so, she laughed. She ended up going in October. But she goes to New York, and a friend of mine was asking me, how's Olivia doing? I said, it's so fun to watch, because starting salary in Manhattan, you can't afford anything, right? So she's got this little 450 square foot apartment with a roommate, but finding it and fitting it into her budget and texting us, look what I found at the thrift. I got a nightstand table for $15. and watching her, she's so much like thriving in conquering this and building her client base and all this kind of stuff. So a friend of mine was asking me how she's doing. And I was describing that. And I said, because we're not helping her. And this guy is a good friend of mine. He goes, what? You're not helping her? I said, no, she's a college graduate. He goes, that is so harsh. I said, well, welcome to reality, but it's fun to watch them get strong and thrive. And so anyway, we could write a book on that one, right?
Well, maybe you should. I'd read that one. I'll buy your first copy. Oh my gosh. Well, I
don't want to see my kids struggle. Our other daughter, first fender bender, and she's calling, what do I do? The insurance, look, here's the insurance guy's number. You got it on your card, call him and work it out, and so I hung up the phone and I'm going, yes, this is going to be so fun to watch. So,
well, this is good because I think we can connect resilience, grit, tenacity, perseverance, forbearance, all these things, steadfastness to the trust muscle. And let's just kind of swing back into this. As we're building the trust muscle, Dr. Cloud, there comes a point, I think, in all of our lives where it's this. How do you know when we should withhold trust? In other words, at what point is it not safe? Or better question, when is it safe or okay or good advice to say, I'm done, I'm setting the boundary, I don't care what you do, I'm not trusting you, because a lot of people, a lot of teams.
I'm not trusting you. ... Until.
Say more.
Well, in other words, it's there are gates that we close until certain requirements are met.
Okay.
And then if they do, and as the fifth point shows in the dashboard I've built here, then there's a track record of that, and there's enough time where we can really try. Then we might remove a gate where we previously said no. So it's like they might not be, they might be Mr. Right, but not Mr. Right now, for example. So it's not black and white. But when you say, where do I draw the line? That's really why I wrote the book, was to I did a factor analysis kind of all the research out there in business and life and marriage and relationships about all the issues involved in trust. And what I found was they really load up into 5 buckets. And so how do we know? Well, we need to check the 5 boxes. That's kind of how I see it.
So let's just go there for a minute. What is the first essential of trust? What's foundational?
The very first one is we can't trust somebody who doesn't understand what we need and what we feel and what we want, what hurts us, what puts us at risk, what helps us. In other words, the old psychological term for this is when we are mirrored. And this is neurological. God has wired every human with mirror neurons. It starts with a baby. When a mother, that newborn, when a mother mirrors, in other words, the baby's upset and the mother responds in tone, oh, you're upset. Yeah, oh, come on. Yeah. And the baby's sensing, oh, she gets me. She knows what I'm feeling. She cares about what I'm feeling. The baby understands that you understand. Well, that neurologically opens the system up. How many times have you ever had a conversation with somebody and you walk away and you feel like, they didn't hear me. They didn't get it. When we move forward with somebody that's not getting it, I mean, how many times does somebody walk home to a note after 20 years of marriage and says, I'm done? And they're surprised that, well, she's been telling you for 20 years. And yet people try to get people to trust them by persuasion before understanding. The Bible says he who gives an answer before he listens, before he understands, is a fool. It's a big deal. I was talking about this in a leadership conference one day, and a guy walks up to me and says, I'm the lead negotiator, hostage negotiator for the FBI. He said, everything you just talked about is our entire training program. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm the guy straps a bomb to him in a bank, has 20 hostages. I don't walk in and start trying to talk him out of doing this. So, dude, this is a bad idea. This doesn't end well. I walk in and ask him his name and then tell him my name. And I say, so tell me, how do we get here today? What's been going on? And like Proverbs says, a person's intentions are deep waters and we're trying to draw them out, but you got to hear them. And when they do, the crack starts to open a little bit. Now we're talking, but not until we understand. So many conflicts go away when somebody feels hurt, period.
I really appreciate that. I think you opened up a segue to one of my favorite sections of your new book, Trust. We get caught in trying to convince people. You just said it this way, persuasion before knowing. We get caught in trying to convince people rather than knowing them intimately. So what's the skill set that we need? How do we foster knowing versus persuading so that trust is established and sustained?
Well, let's just kind of make it simple, and let's start with listening and curiosity. If we're curious and they feel like we're curious about them, then that draws them out. And then when you're listening, and there's so much involved in nonverbals in this part of it because it's neurological and psychological and physiological.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got to feel that you're present. If you're looking off and checking your phone, that's the classic. But they're not with me. So there is a withness. I like the word withness. I like the word presence. The developmental, neurobiologists talk about attunement, that we're in tune. And you'll see people in conversation, just like a baby, something feels good, they start saying yes, or they start saying no. They turn their head, no, they turn away. And so there's an attunement. And the more with tone and attention and listening and asking more and mirroring and you're hearing the content, you're hearing the feeling, you're hearing the consequences in everything they say. Gosh, so when they were late, that must have really, really hurt. And it screwed up your whole day. Boom. All three elements are there. And they're like, yeah. And then they go further. That's a moving towards because we hear.
That's so good. So if folks joined with us want to take this practically into relationships today, can you walk us through some helpful prompts? I think about, like you were saying,
we're only on the first point.
Exactly.
There's 5 of these.
Exactly right.
You want a simple one today?
Yeah.
In every conversation, go listen 51% of the time.
Mm.
And go through your day and watch all your conversations and ask yourself, did they listen 51% of the time? You'd be amazed with some people. Amazed.
What does it take for us to slow down then? Because I think about, and you stole the word out of my mouth, I was going to ask you about attuning in relationships. And I think about reflecting feeling, reflecting meaning. Hey, what I heard you say is, it sounds like you said this. What are some ways that we can grow in this area really practically? What does that look like?
Well, you could even Google listening skills, right? Broaden your lexicon of words. What you just said, sometimes people say, gosh, I hear you. That's awesome.
Yes.
Because somebody feels like, finally, somebody heard me. Even say it's not rocket science, but just when somebody feels like you're getting it, and whatever simple things like, well, what was that like for you? How'd that affect you? Where'd you go from there? How'd you recover from that? Where are you in that? There's a lot of different ways, but what they just need a sense that you're wanting to know them. That's the simplest way to make it practical.
Let's double down on fixing people versus knowing people. I pulled this quote from your book, and I think, oh gosh, I dog-eared it, I highlighted it, and it is this quote: there are many, many times when attempts to give someone the answer we think they need fail because it is so far from who they really are and what they truly desire and need. So we're back to this. We're not knowing, we're fixing. Anything else we should know about that?
A lot of times, because people haven't listened and tried to understand, they're giving somebody an answer to the wrong problem. Simple example of this. How many squabbles with teenagers and parents, they think it's talking about, well, can I come in after 10, or can I go spend the night with so-and-so? Okay. It's not even about that. What it's about is, how much freedom do I have? And you start to listen, and then you get to a deep feeling maybe that's been residing there for a while is, I don't feel like I have any choices in this house. But that's not what they're asking about. They're asking about going to do something that may or may not be good. And we're playing around on the surface issue. You see the same thing in marriage. You see the same thing in business. How many great negotiators understand this? When somebody's asking for certain, they might be asking for a deal point And the great negotiators realize what's driving the need for that payment at that time, when really maybe what they need is terms. Maybe what they need is some flexibility. Maybe it's a cash flow issue that we can help solve for them. But if you're not listening, you get stuck on the point. Maybe they need time. Who knows? Maybe they want more control. Maybe, who knows? We don't know. We don't know till we listen.
Okay, if we don't know till we listen, I think there's a skill set that we could grow in. It's discernment. How do we grow in discernment then, Dr. Cloud, in the context of all our relationships? What does that require?
Well, there's an interesting verse in Hebrews, which is, it's almost like the person that wrote the Bible understood the brain.
Yeah.
And it says this, it says, solid food is for the mature. Now, what is solid food? Well, that's, babies get away from applesauce and get to solid food when they can handle it. And solid food takes more skills. You got to chew it, you got to swallow it, and all that kind of stuff. Well, the solid food of life, like marriage, like building a community, like making a career work, that's solid food. And that's for the mature, those who are complete in all these skills. So here's what it says. It says, solid food is for the mature. Think about real life is for the mature who, through practice and experience, have had their senses trained to discern good from evil. That's the construct you're talking about.
Yes, sir.
And it comes into our senses because we go through and have a lot of practice. And I'm not that smart, but I have had 1 gazillion hours of clinical experience and, consulting experience. And trust me, I'm just not that smart. But when you've seen something 1,000 times, you surely do see it quicker than when you first began. So somebody walks in. We used to laugh. My team, sometimes we could get a voicemail from a new patient, and I could tell you what the next 3 years are going to look like.
Really?
They're just trying to set up the first appointment. Why? Because pattern recognition. You know what those phrases mean. You know what that tone, you know what the active versus the passive tense means, blah, blah, blah. You just seen it, and it's just experience.
Having our senses trained, I love that. I think it's Hebrews 5, if I'm not mistaken. But it points to
5:14.
Yeah, it points to maturity. And if we're staying on discernment and learning these things, what's the fine line then between discernment and suspicion? One's healthy, one doesn't seem to be helpful.
Well, in the way that you're using it, I would say suspicion is when we're starting out suspecting.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I hate it when I hear the phrase, I'm trying to believe the best. Why in the world would you want to do that? If you're walking down the sidewalk or your doorbell rings, you don't know who's on the other side. Why don't we, instead of believe the best, be open to the truth and then go find the truth? It's sort of like the old phrase, trust and verify. No, verify and then trust. If I'm suspicious, I'm going to go in looking for a reason. There's a suspicion. I'll give you another example. Legally,
Great.
I trust my daughters. I told them, we're not going to screw around with your room. If you want it to be a wreck, you got to live in it. I don't have to live in it. Den's not going to look like that, but it's your room, right? Unless I start to smell toxic fumes coming out of there. Now I have something the cops call probable cause. Now I'm suspecting something. Until then, I'm walking down the hall, doors closed, and I don't smell smoke. So I wouldn't live in that mess. I'd clean it up. Now, don't get me wrong, you've trained them to be able to be neat and orderly, but I always felt like, they have to have dominion over some things. But if you give me probable cause to lose your dominion, then that's what the cops are going to do anyway.
Yeah. Dr. Cloud, in landing the plane on this conversation, I think I want to land here, and there's so much more we got unpacked. In fact, folks, I want to just say that in the show notes at wintoday.tv, a link is there. Purchase Dr. Henry Cloud's book, Trust. It's a must-read, I think. It's really a must-read, value add to our lives. But Dr. Cloud, let's land here today. Just because we forgive someone doesn't mean we trust them again. Tell me more. Take us wherever you want.
It's a delineation of time, really. Forgiveness has to do with something that has already happened. Forgiveness has to do with the past. It only takes one person to forgive. Mm-hmm. If we're going to trust somebody, we're talking about tomorrow. So I've got to, after I've forgiven somebody, I've got to have engagement with them in some very specific ways to know that I'm going to trust tomorrow that this won't happen again. You don't forgive tomorrow. I mean, in other than a positional way, you're always, willing to we're going to turn the other cheek and I want to restore everything I can. But after something's happened, I'm going to forgive you. But we got to, there's some conversation and some behaviors that are going to have to take place before I trust again. That's the short answer. And, we talked about the understanding part. There's 4 more elements of this. I would just encourage, people to get the book.
Absolutely. Again, wintoday.tv, folks. A link is in the show notes. I'll land the plane here, Dr. Cloud. In this subject or any subject, is there a question you wish more people would ask you?
Yeah. What's your address? Because I'd like to send you some sour gummy worms. That would be one. Gosh.
I will be sending some to you.
Thank you. You mean specifically in the area of trust?
Yeah. Yeah. Like if you're having this conversation with a lot of people and you're going, dang, I wish they would have asked me this. What would be that?
It's a little bit like what's more important, air, water, or food. It's kind of like a lot of them.
Yeah.
But one of the food groups that I would ask them to do is, why don't you just look back, do an audit, and look at things that have gone well and look at things that have not gone well in where you extended trust, and learn from both of those railroad tracks. And the ones that have gone well, what has been present in the way that you extended it and the way that they lived up to it and the qualities that they had in the relationship and the context. And in the places where it hadn't gone well, what was your pattern? Were you too quick? Were you avoiding some things? Were you in great need? So it didn't matter about this because I really need this,
Mm-hmm.
The Bible says to a hungry person, pretty much everything tastes good. And to somebody who's full, even honey, it says, I don't want any more. So I just want people to hear that it's important for us to learn our patterns because our patterns become our future.
Our patterns become our future. So good. We'll land there. Folks, the book Trust. He is Dr. Henry Cloud. Dr. Cloud, thanks for being here. I could spend 3 more hours with you. This book is just chock full of wisdom, and I wish I could dive deeper, but for the sake of time, we'll land here today. Thank you so much. You're truly a hero in my life, and couldn't thank you more for
Chris,
it today.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the time, and you do great things. So
thank you, sir.
Hope everybody keeps tuning in.
Thanks, Dr. Cloud.